Hello, my name is Daisy Mwangi, and I'll be doing my presentation on racism and medicine. Um, Really, the concept of racism and medicine isn't new. The failure to recognize pain of Black patients is traced back to Dr. James Marion Sims, a 19th century physician and the father of gynecology. And so, Marion has been heavily glorified for his contributions to medicine, but the enslaved women on whom he experimented on is often excluded. Marin conducted experiments on many Black women, but today we only know of three that he named in his autobiography, and that is Annika, Lucy, and Betsy. And so in 1845, he set up a private hospital in his house in Montgomery, Alabama, where slave owners would bring their slaves to be treated. And he didn't do this because he genuinely wanted to and cared about the health of the slaves, but instead, it was really out of the desire of the slave owners to keep their slaves working and in the best interest of Marion because he was getting paid and also had subjects to experiment on. So Annika was the first case of VSF, which is the retrovesticular fistula. And so before that, Annika was about 17 years old when Sims was called in to assist with their labor. And Sims helped deliver the baby with forceps, but Sims was later called in again and discovered that she had fistula. So initially, he didn't want to, he couldn't do anything because he didn't have any of the proper tools to, help her out. And so after his invention of the speculum, he was called back to operate on her. And um, this tool you see right here at the bottom right hand is the speculum in which he invented and uh, worked on many people afterwards with. And so the other person is Lucy. She was about 18 at the time, and Sims describes excitingly going into um, her her I don't know if you say like surgery or whatnot at this time, but he describes like working on Lucy as the season of philosophical experiment, and so Lucy almost died during her procedure because um, she had a blood infection, and but that didn't honestly stop Sims from operating on her countless other times. So the third person was Betsy, and Betsy was around 17 or 18 at the time, and he Sims was called in because after giving birth to a baby, Betsy was unable to control her bladder, and was sent, to Sims by her owner for examination. And so here, when we look at the concept of race and pain, it's clear that Marin really didn't care about the slaves who came to him seeking help because Marin at this time didn't believe that Black women specifically um, felt that uh, felt the same amount of pain as white people, and this is clear because um, during this time anesthesia was widely adopted, but um, he always said that he didn't believe Black people experience pain in the same way as white people. And so even during Anarcha's, Lucy, and Betsy's procedures, um, anesthesia was definitely not used. And so we must recognize the inhumane treatment Black women faced, and not only that, understand that Black women had no voice. Marion didn't care about how Black women felt during these procedures. There were simply experiments for him, subjects that he could work on to prove his discoveries. And it's clear doctors didn't respect women, and this is seen through Henrietta Lacks. And so in 1951, Henrietta Lacks visited the Johns Hopkins Hospital complaining of vaginal bleeding. Once she got there, gynecologist Dr. Howard Jones discovered a large tumor on her cervix. And during this time, Johns Hopkins Hospital was the only one that was treating Black people. And so Miss Lacks began undergoing radium treatments for cervical cancer. And during this time, A sample of her cancer cells was retrieved during a biopsy and sent to Dr. George Gay's tissue lab. Dr. Gay had been collecting cells from patients who came to Johns Hopkins Hospital with cervical cancer, but each sample he retrieved quickly died, and Gay discovered that Miss Lax's cells, on the other hand, were unlike any others he had seen, and hers doubled every 20 to 24 hours. So today, these incredible cells, nicknamed Hella cells from the first two letters of her first and last names, are used to study the effects of toxins, drugs, hormones, and viruses on the growth of cancer cells without experimenting on humans, and they have been used to test the effects of radiation, poisons, and human genomes to learn about how viruses work. And her cells have actually uh, led to the development of the polio vaccine. And so, really, Henrietta Lacks's story also just illustrates the racial inequalities that are embedded in the U.S. research and healthcare systems. See, Lax was a black woman, and during this time when she went to the hospital, the hospital where her cells were collected was one of the only few that provided medical care to black people, and none of the biotechnology or any other companies that had profited from her cells passed any money to her family. And so not only do we see that um, huge corporations gained a lot of money from Henrietta Lacks, but we see that when it came to her consent of her cells being used, that was never brought into question. And it's crazy because like it's not until like years later where um, you know companies are like, oh yeah, like it's not until like Sculat, whom we'll talk about in the next slides, wrote a book and really just released the story of Henrietta that the family actually got compensation years later. And so Henrietta, this uh, Rebecca Sculat wrote a book on the immortal life on Henrietta Lacks about her cells. And one of the quotes that I got from the book was, "Doctors examined her inside and out, pressing her stomach, inserting new catheters into her bladder, fingers into her vagina and anus, needles into her veins." And so this is a description of what Henrietta went through as she was getting these radium treatments. Really, we can see that Henrietta went from being a patient to a medical subject. And another quote I pulled out was um, one that says, "One afternoon, as Henrietta lay on the couch, she lifted her shirt to show Margaret and Sadie what the treatments had done to her. Sadie gasped. The skin from Henrietta's breast to her pelvis was charred, a deep black from the radiation." And so, really, Henrietta's body demonstrates the pain suffered, and it's interesting because you would never hear of this happening to a white woman. Um, and it's clear that when it came to Henrietta, there were no boundaries at all. Yeah, here and oftentimes all we hear is really how the advancements of medicine came about, but we don't recognize that a woman such as Henrietta Lacks also aided in that development. So another quote says, "There's no way of knowing whether or how Henrietta's treatment would have differed if she'd been white. According to Howard Jones, Henrietta got the same care any white patient would have. The biopsy, the radium treatment, and radiation were all standard for the day, but several studies have shown that black patients were treated and hospitalized at later stages of their illness than white patients, and once hospitalized, they got fewer pain medications and higher mortality rates." And so Sculat points out that, yeah, it's unclear whether or not her treatment would have differed if she was white, but it's all honest. It's clear that Henrietta definitely didn't get the same treatment as a white woman because number one, Henrietta was already attending um, one of the few hospitals that actually treated black women, and so number one, there's already a clear distinction that there definitely was a difference in how the treatments were when it came to white women and black women. And so yeah, and also I love that Sculat points out that that Black women were often treated at later stages of their sickness compared to like white women, and this is something that we'll talk about more. Um, and so, continuing on this story of racism in medicine, I found an article by Kelly Hoffman, and Hoffman writes on the racial bias in pain. Hoffman argues that Black Americans are systemically undertreated for pain relative to white Americans, and uh, she uh, she talks about how white patients and Black patients are given different types of medications, and oftentimes Black patients are less likely to be given pain medications, and if they actually do get some, they receive lower quantities. And so Hoffman explains that these disparities in pain treatment could reflect an over prescription of medications for white patients, under prescription of medications for Black patients, or more likely just both of them. And so Hoffman cites a study examining pain management among patients with metastatic or recurrent cancer, which found that only 35 of racial minority patients received the appropriate prescriptions as established by the World Health Organization guidelines, compared with 50% of non minority patients. And so Hoffman explains that the first possibility is that physicians recognize Black patients' pain but do not treat it, or perhaps due to the concerns about non-compliance or access to healthcare. Um, a second possibility is that the physicians do not recognize Black patients' pain in the first place, and and thus cannot treat it. And so, in fact, recent work suggests that racial bias in pain treatment may stem in part from racial bias in perceptions of other people's pain. And so, this research has shown that people assume a priori that Blacks feel less pain compared to whites. And in a study by Stanton and al., in which Hoffman cites, patients were asked to report how much pain they were experiencing, and physicians were asked to rate how much pain they thought the physicians were experiencing. And the physicians were more likely to underestimate the pain of Black patients relatively to non-Black patients. So it's clear that that there is disparities within medicine, and Black women and men, and really Black patients overall, are seen to experience less pain. Um, and so yeah, and so yeah, and so when connecting all of this to all the course material, I chose the Robin DiAngelo White Fragility text and Kendi's text on how to be anti-racist. And in White Fragility, D'Angelo talks about the difficulty white Americans face when discussing racism. D'Angelo notes that most white people often become defensive when the question of race is brought up. And so D'Angelo highlights how social and economic interests led science to justify enslavement and racial inferiority. And D'Angelo argues that race is a social construct and how racism is really all a system. And so D'Angelo writes in one of the quotes, and she says, "Being perceived as white carries more than a mere racial classification. It is a social and institutional status and identity imbued with legal, political, economic, and social rights and privileges that are denied to others." And so I think this quote is applicable to this project because it's clear that medical resources and institutions are not designed to cater to Black people. Um, like yes, there were Black hospitals, but when you really think about when you really think about it, like education was restricted to African Americans during like Henrietta's time. And so it's hard to say that Black people were getting equal care to that of white people. And then another aspect of D'Angelo was white people getting defensive. So an example of this is really seen with the James Marion statue in Central Park. When it was removed, a statement was made, and it stated his brilliant achievement carried the fame of American surgery throughout the entire world. And it's like when the issue of racism was brought up, one individual was more reluctant to defend the the study of science, or just how medical advancement, while ignoring the suffering of many Black women and men. And so it's really a connection between like how um, D'Angelo was talking about how it's so easy for white people to get defensive, and really it's because they don't understand the systemic privileges embedded that benefited them and destroyed the lives of others. For example, Henrietta or Anna or Lucy and Betsy, like they don't really see that. And so going back to just how D'Angelo talks about white people and them being defensive, and then in the Kendi article, How to Be Anti-Racist, Kendi illustrates the difference between racist, anti-racist actions, ideas, and policies. Kendi uses his personal experiences to describe, excuse me, how he at times was racist and now strives to be anti-racist. And so Kendi aims to show that there's no racist neutral policies, and that really all policies are, you know, kind of racist. And so Kendi states, we can unknowingly strive to be racist, to be a racist. We can knowingly strive to be anti-racist. And Kendi is arguing that that an anti-racist requires one to persistently be self-aware, and really want to reevaluate oneself and to self-criticize. And so Kendi's reading is applicable to this project because it's clear that most racism in medicine is rooted in racist policies that came with slavery. And to be anti-racist in medicine, we must acknowledge the racist laws embedded in institutions, but also live in awareness. And so it's not just enough to say that African Americans faced medical segregation, but doctors can become anti-racist by listening to Black patients today when they say that they're in pain. And the last case study I will cover is one on Tiana. I'm not going to play the video because it's a little long, but I'll give you a quick summary. So Tiana underwent unplanned emergency cesarean section during the delivery of her sons, and basically her experience was one of unprofessionalism. During this time, like Tiana noted that anesthesiologists, sorry if I said that wrong, were pushing her down physically to lay her down in bed. And basically, she says that her experience with the doctors is very traumatic. And so, when interviewed, Dr. Martin Granoff says her experience was traumatic and she had to abandon the idea of having a vaginal delivery. She had to get general anesthesia and couldn't be awake for the procedure. And although that was a traumatic experience. There was no harm to the baby or her, and she adjusted and got over it. And so Tiana says that they were trying to discount what she was saying by trying to humanize their experience, but not humanizing what she was telling them. And so it's really going back to this concept of pain, um, the pain that the Black women faced, and really when they go to voice what they're going through, they're often met with, "Oh, you don't know what you're feeling," and so Tiana's story can be related to D'Angelo's text because we see doctors getting defensive when her experience is brought up, and that's clear with Dr. Martin Granoff. And it's unclear how many doctors were white during her birth, but the reason Tiana joined the medical field was to ensure Black mothers and women in general got the care she never got. She wants to ensure that her experience isn't reflected on somebody else's. And it's also clear that there's a systemic issue which involves racism. Tiana says that when it comes to treatment, um, there's a clear difference between how women are treated. There's a clear difference between how white women are treated compared to Black patients. And overall, during this project, I really just want to note that there is racism in medicine and it does exist. And oftentimes, Black women have to constantly justify their pain or explain themselves. And it shouldn't have to be this way because, they're no different from white women or really anybody else. And um, it's clear that as a country, we do have to continue to push policies that are going to benefit Black women and also ensure that they're getting the care that they need. And yeah, that concludes my presentation. Um, yeah, thank you.